Yeah, hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining our webinar on the 10 most underreported humanitarian crises in 2020. Today with a focus on Zambia. I also would like to welcome you on behalf of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom and CARE Germany, the two organizations that invited you to this event, which is the very last one in a series of 10. My name is Najima El Moussaoui. I'm a freelance TV journalist based in Cologne, Germany. First, I would like to say some words about the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom and about CARE International, just in case that some of you might not know one of the organizations. The Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom is a foundation for liberal politics in Germany. It exists since 1958 and it is close to the Liberal Free Democratic Party, FDP, in Germany. Currently, it operates in more than 60 countries by offering political education, events, and publications. In Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, the foundation wants to promote human rights and a social market economy. CARE International is a global humanitarian agency with 14 members, such as CARE Germany. Fighting poverty is the main goal of their work in more than 100 countries. Among them is Zambia. And since 5 years, CARE International publishes an annual report with the title Suffering in Silence. And Zambia is number 10 on the list of the underreported humanitarian crisis of 2020. And today we want to do what many international newspapers or TV channels in the Western world did not do sufficiently, according to CARE International. We want to reflect about the humanitarian, the political, and the economic situation in Zambia. If you want to read the whole report or if you're interested in the study itself, please visit the CARE International homepage. A few days ago, I just did a Google News search to see what headlines there are about Zambia. Here are some of them. The online newspaper, The Catholic Sun, for example, titles, "Bishops plea for peace and fair elections ahead of Zambia's August vote." The author writes that violence is rising and the government is pushing against dissidents. Africa Report writes about US President Joe Biden willing to donate COVID-19 vaccine doses to Zambia and some other African countries. And then we have some sport news from the BBC about the Zambian female soccer team, the Copper Queens, that is indeed the only team representing Africa in the Olympic Games in Tokyo this year. Why the name Copper Queens? Because Zambia is one of the largest copper producers in the world. So this is the image we can get of Zambia through the media. And as you might see, only one of the 3 headlines were from Western media. And now let's see what information we can get from our experts who can give us first-hand information because they are all locals. A very warm welcome to Rose Sakala, Trevor Hambai, and Dr. Henry Lungo. It's a pleasure to have you on the panel. I want to start by introducing Rose Sakala because she will give us an input right now. And after that, I will introduce the other 2 guests.
Okay, video.
Rose Sakala is a political scientist and researcher with a special interest in human rights, gender equality, peace, security, and governance issues. She is a member of the largest opposition party in Zambia, the United Party of National Development, UPND. And she is vice president for Southern Africa within the Africa Liberal Network, which is a partner of the Liberal International. Rose said, quote, "I'm a disciplined and well-oriented woman who has a vision for a bright future with a difference." Welcome, Rose, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm delighted, I'm honored to be here to say something about Zambia. I thank the FNF for organizing this presentation. It gives me an opportunity to briefly say something about Zambia. So thank you so much. To start with, I would like to say something about Zambia. It is located in southern part of Africa. It's a landlocked country surrounded by 8 countries. That's Angola, Namibia, to the west, Botswana, Zimbabwe to the south, Mozambique, Malawi to the east, Tanzania, and the DRC Congo to the north. Landlocked in itself is an advantage because we are connected to all these countries in trade. Zambia has a population of about 18 million people, 50% of which are women, young people under the age of 35, about 75%. So it's quite a young population, which is an advantage in itself in terms of the very fact that it comprises the energetic and the productive workforce. Zambia is quite a large country. It's about 752,000 square kilometers. It's, much of it is arable land, very rich, very fertile for agriculture. We have lots of water from the lakes, from the rivers. One of the largest rivers in Africa actually runs through Zambia, the Zambezi, after which our country is named. In addition, Zambia is one of the largest producers of copper globally. And in addition to that, we have got other resources, other minerals. So basically, I would say Zambia is quite a rich country, at least potentially. Briefly, the historic background of Zambia, the political and historical history of Zambia is that we became independent in 1964 from the British, and we were a multi-party system by then. However, in the early 70s, at the height of the liberation struggle in Southern Africa, Zambia decided to become a one-party state. Reasons for this was to guard against the infiltration and instability from the Southern African racist regimes, or rather from the racist regimes and from the apartheid regime that we were fighting against. At this moment in time, Zambia was hosting liberation movements at one time or the other on our soil. It was quite a risk economically and socially, but it was a worthy cause. In 1991, having achieved our goal, and that is bringing down apartheid, bringing down the racist regimes, Zambia decided to revert to multipartism. And since then, we've been very stable. We have managed to change from one government to the other, peacefully handing over power, the ruling party not resisting losing power. And we have upheld the rule of law. We have upheld human rights, and corruption was really not an issue in this country. However, come 2011, with the coming to power of the new regime, the Patriotic Front, there has been a downturn, a drastic one, in our credentials. We have seen institutions of governance weakening in a very unprecedented manner. We have seen a breakdown in the rule of law. We have seen human rights abuses. We have witnessed unprecedented corruption. And this really has adversely affected Zambia's reputation and the livelihoods of our people. In making this short presentation, my aim is not to paint Africa or Zambia as a lost cause, but rather to give a clear picture of the specific challenges that exist at certain times because of failure of leadership. So that those who wish to fully engage or genuinely engage in what is going on in Zambia or in Africa will know how to position themselves. Now coming to the subject that we are discussing today, the humanitarian situation in Zambia. I would like to start by mentioning that in this country, we have what is called the Disaster Management and Mitigation Unit. This was created about 30 years ago by the previous government. This is a statutory organ through which the overall implementation and coordination of disaster management activities and programs in this country are done. This was a very positive move, as it was an indication that the government, or at least the government at that time, realized that it has a responsibility to look after those that are vulnerable. And coming to the current situation, which is the topic for discussion today, the humanitarian crisis came about because in 2018 to 2019 season, there was a drought in the half southern part of Zambia, which is really our breadbasket. This is where a lot of farming is done. In fact, including commercial farmers, many of them are in the southern half of Zambia. This is where there's a lot of livestock, including cattle. So this is the area that was hit by drought. So it led to crop failure and it led to animal diseases. What compounded the situation was that prior to that season, 2017 to 2018, there was in the northern part of Zambia, heavy rains that led to a lot of floods, which also destroyed crops. So we came to a situation whereby in 5 years, Zambia had the lowest production of maize. And that was very critical because maize is our staple food. So that was quite almost catastrophic. Following that disaster, what happened, or the crisis, what happened was 2.3 million people were affected by food insecurity. And that comprises about 13% of the population. So that was quite huge. So the response of the government was food distribution and cash transfer. Now, what I can say as of now, we are not yet out of the woods. The reason we are not yet out of the woods is because the situation, the crisis that has been ongoing has been compounded by the COVID-19. What has happened now with the COVID-19 is that beyond the COVID-19, pardon me, beyond the COVID-19, what has further compounded the situation is the problems of indebtedness and sustainable debt, in fact. And that has led to a lot of poverty among our people. And this has further been compounded by the breakdown in the rule of law, the corruption that's ongoing. And we found ourselves in a situation whereby the donors in 2017, for example, that included the UK, Finland, Sweden, Ireland, and UNICEF, suspended social welfare aid under the social cash transfer scheme to Zambia amid allegations of massive corruption. Massive corruption is really an issue in this country. It has adversely affected service delivery to the social sectors. And this, as usually happens under corrupt and dictatorial regimes, lack of transparency has set in as a way of obscuring or covering up the truth. This has made it very difficult for independent media to access information and report accordingly. Coupled with this, the public media has become a political tool of the ruling party that reports only what the government wants to hear, and not the corrupt or skewed manner in which the humanitarian aid, for example, might be administered, as independent media would do. Lack of transparency and accountability is really an issue in this country. Any government administration that's corrupt and dictatorial is also more likely to control the media because they would like to control what is being reported. And we know that certain media houses in this country have been closed for reporting what the government did not want the public to know. The lack of respect for human rights is also a major concern or challenge in this country. For unless government administration genuinely embraces human rights and respects the rights of its people, such a government can never fully be committed to addressing issues of the vulnerable. Were it so, there would have been a commitment to ensuring that there was adequate information flow through the media as a way of ensuring that those that are affected by the crisis receive deserving support. We also have a challenge of a weak, very weak, in fact, civil society due to lack of funding and fear of reporting the truth. Certain thriving civil society organizations are just a mere piece of, a mouthpiece of the ruling party, and are therefore often constrained to report truthfully and independently. Another issue that has emerged now, or which is emerging, is lack of digital access. Lack of digital access is the major constraint in this country. It's actually very limited. In this day and age, when news can be transmitted through internet over the phone, Zambia's access to internet remains at less than 20%. The digital access is one of the major constraints to information sharing, to education, and the development in general. There is urgent need for Zambia to find a way of increasing its digital access through increased investment in this area. Going forward, Zambia needs a government which, unlike the current one, will be committed to overcoming this challenge. Just one example of another developing crisis in Zambia is the fact that the education of the majority of children has been frequently disrupted with the school closures whenever there have been upsurges in the rate of COVID-19 infection.
Thank you.
Children go for weeks without attending school, as the case is now.
Rose, thank you very much so far. Sorry for interrupting you. Let's keep the rest for the discussion. We still have time to go into the discussion. Thank you so much for this overview on the situation in Zambia. We will go into detail on different points that you just mentioned. Sorry for interrupting you. Thank you very much so far.
Thank you.
Now it's time to introduce the two other guests. Thank you for your patience. We have Dr. Henry Lungu, who works for CARE International in Zambia as a program director for climate, environment, and livelihood, and as an emergency coordinator. Before, he worked for the government in the Ministry of Agriculture, and he has also working experience in local government councils, plus more than 20 years of experience in the field of humanitarian programs. Welcome, Henry. And then we have, last but not least, Trevor Hambai, who can assess the situation in the country from an economic point of view. Mr. Hambai is a financial analyst and senior managing partner at Development Finance Associates, a social enterprise fund manager that has established the first startup funding program in Zambia. And Trevor has the vision of an economic emancipation of the African continent. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the panel. And if you, dear audience, have any questions to our experts, please use the Q&A function on Zoom if you're watching us via Zoom. So Rose already mentioned several points. She talked about the media, about corruption, about hunger, etc., about the humanitarian situation also. And I would like to go a bit into detail talking about the humanitarian aspects and COVID-19. And I would like to know a bit more about the humanitarian situation on the ground. Would you, the three of you, would you summarize the situation as a humanitarian crisis? Rose said that it's not a lost cause. What would you say? The other, maybe Henry and Trevor first. Is it a humanitarian crisis? And could you describe a bit the situation, the daily life of the people in Zambia? Henry, do you want to answer the question?
Yes. Looking at the type of service that we are providing as a nation to respond to the COVID pandemic, our health services at the moment are almost overwhelmed. And because of responding to COVID, other services are being, downplayed. So the other services are not getting the attention that they're supposed to get. And also the numbers, because the numbers we are getting may not necessarily be the true reflection of the situation, because I don't think we are doing enough tests.
I understand, okay.
Yeah, so it is a crisis, because if it goes beyond this, we are just managing now, because we have shortages of oxygen, we have shortages of bed space. So in that respect, it is.
Trevor, would you agree, or do you have something to add from your perspective? You are muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry. I totally agree with Henry in that we are really looking towards an issue where we might be facing a crisis. The key aspect is that we do not have the empirical evidence that will support this, because we haven't kept our records to show exactly the number of people that are totally affected. And we have gotten to a point where the health facilities are actually turning away people because they do not have room to be able to deal with the pandemic. But it is important to note that prior to the COVID pandemic, the country as Zambia had a 56% poverty level in the country, which is really speaking to the fact that 56% of the population was living below the $1.90 a day. And with the pandemic, the two things that we have seen, obviously, is the impact of the pandemic has increased vulnerability of communities, but it has also reduced income levels of a lot of people in the community, which is speaking to an increase in the poverty levels. So if you look at those perspectives, yes, we are looking at a situation where this is a crisis and we need it to be addressed.
Okay, and apart from testing, Rose, maybe this is a question for you. Would you say the government had a working strategy to fight the virus? I think you would say no, but what concretely, maybe you can give us 1 or 2 examples. What would have been a better measure concretely?
I think we all know that COVID is not going to end now. We had hoped last year that it would end like almost in a few months. But to date, when you see the example of the closures of the schools, it shows that the government has no strategy in place. The children are meant to stay home whenever there is an upsurge in the COVID infections. As it is now, the children won't be back to school until sometime in August. And those are the majority of children. Very few of children have the privilege of having online, those who are in very high paying school. So I would say almost all our children are just languishing on the streets. So if the government were really concerned about the vulnerable, I think the priority would have been put in schools. Find means of ensuring that there's more access there's more digital access, knowing that if they don't go to school, they will end up maybe in drug abuse, misconduct, because there are also no social welfare services for children.
And since when?
Children have
excuse me.
Social.
Since when are they out of school with children? Since when?
For weeks now, at least not less than a month. And they won't be back until sometime in August, I think mid-August. And even then I doubt, because we are having elections on 12 August. So most probably a week or 2 after that.
Okay, I understand. Henry, you working for CARE International, did you have any possibilities to help? I mean, providing masks or something like that?
Yeah, a lot of people in the civil society movement, in the private sector, have responded and are providing personal protective equipment. We've gone further than that. In most of the areas that we work, when the pandemic broke, we put aside resources to actually provide equipment and tools to partner institutions like rural health centers and schools, and also where we are doing water and sanitation programs, we increased the number of water points, and in peri-urban areas, even went as far as putting integrated water systems. This is all to try and improve on the hygiene. I mean, in terms of prevention of transmission, everything is around keeping clean. So if we get more access to people get more access to water, then that cuts down the transmission routes. Okay. So we are doing that, and also talking about the issue that Trevor talked about, on the economic side. We have started doing programs that are trying to protect the investment that has been done in long-term development, especially around our work on food and nutrition security amongst the rural population, targeting women of reproductive age, those that are lactating, and also children under 5. So we are putting in systems to build resilience to protect that livelihood. The same for adolescent learners, because of what Rose said, people have been out of school. We have found that a lot of these children have ended up actually dropping out altogether. So we have started projects that are trying to get these children to fast track and go back into school.
And how do you reach these people, the children or the adults? How do you reach them? Because Rose drew a picture of no access to the internet and no freedom of press, etc. So I can imagine it's quite difficult to reach the people and give them the information and tell them how and where they can get help.
Yeah, it's difficult to reach them through that media. But what we've done is working with the schools. We have identified which learners, each time there's a break, are not coming back. And we have trained community members who live in those communities who are following up with those. And we have trained, together with Ministry of Education, some teachers that are reaching out to these learners so that they have accelerated learning. When the schools will open, wherever it is, they would have caught up and would come back into the mainstream education.
Okay, so school is a very important systemic
education.
Okay, now I understand why school has this importance that they go to school. I would like to remind the audience that you have the possibility to ask your questions. There's a Q&A button if you're using Zoom. So please ask your questions so that I can pass them over to the panelists. Now I'd like to talk a bit more about the role of the media. I mean, international media is not reporting enough about Zambia. That's what the CARE report said, and I mentioned that Zambia is on number 10. But on the other hand, do you think that the Zambian government supports the work of the media professionals sufficiently? Henry or Trevor? Rose already said her opinion about that.
So from my perspective, there are two sides to it. There's domestic media and there's also international media. On the domestic media, we are restricted in terms of what they're putting out most of the media here will be speaking to be pro-government programs and will not tell you about the negative aspects that need to be addressed within the country. And that has been the challenge. With the international media, I think they are more focused towards issues that will be able to make international headlines. And it does not really cover the day-to-day suffering of the people, but more of the issue that speak to global challenges. And I think that has been the space that we have been in. But as well, in terms of where government is, our governance structure is designed in such a way that they do not want this media to be able to go outside the country. So they will do everything they can to ensure that specific media organizations cannot take out domestic information on the international market. So this is speaking to governance structures. And I think it is a matter that relates to freedom of expression that is being clamped down within the country. We have seen a number of media houses in this country that have been speaking negatively of government that have actually been closed down. And so this is also a very, very big issue around governance.
What media does the majority of the people in Zambia consume? I mean, you all three have an academic background, but I mean the not so educated people in your country, how do they listen to radio, or what information, what media do they consume?
I'm not very sure about what the statistics are, but I think most of the rural people would be listening to radio as the main media platform that they use. They obviously do not have electronic as well as print media, but they're usually listening to radio, as well as networking within the community, especially with party structures, which are government political parties, as well as the market systems where they actually do their trading.
Okay, thank you. I see that we have a couple of questions here from Georg Schlachtenberger. The first one, he writes that in 2 weeks there will be elections, an election between President Edgar Lungu and longtime opposition leader Hakainde Hichilema. Are there currently a lot of promises, and would you expect smooth elections without conflicts? Maybe there will be a chance for the better. Who wants to answer this question?
I think I can answer that one.
Please, go ahead, please.
I don't know, my video keeps, have I been closing it?
Yes, I can see you.
I didn't hear much of the question, but I think what I heard was that there are elections in 2 weeks' time. The leading contenders being the current president, the sitting president, and the opposition, Hakainde Hichilema.
The question is whether you expect smooth elections or do you expect conflicts?
I can talk about the current situation that's pertaining on the ground. There's a lot of violence. I've already talked about the human rights abuses. They are rampant. They've been ongoing for some time, including against the leading contender himself, Hakainde Hichilema. And the violence has gone to the extent of not only bodily harm or injuries, we have even had deaths. Only a week ago, one of our young men was hacked just for putting up a poster of Hakainde Hichilema. So we've had a lot of violence and we have only 2 weeks to go. And really there is potential for this violence to continue probably until a few days before election day. But if nothing is done, even the electoral process itself might be disrupted. So violence is real and it's worrisome.
Thank you. Here's another question concerning the elections. Maybe Henry or Trevor could give an answer. How could you assess the situation in Zambia before the upcoming elections? And how are you expecting it to change after the elections? If the ruling PF party would win versus other parties, for example, the liberal UPND winning the elections?
Henry, do you want to answer that one?
No, you lead.
There are obviously two sides. The The key issue around the elections and what happens afterwards is I think the same irrespective of who wins, that the country requires to be able to go into major reforms because of the contraction of the economy. At the moment, the economy is in recession, and for this economy to be to start to rebuild this economy requires us to take major decisions, which are around debt restructuring. The country is carrying a very heavy external debt of $12.7 billion, as well as domestic debt, and it's also defaulted on its commercial debt. So this needs to be resolved, and it will require us to be able probably to agree an IMF package. And to be able to agree an IMF package will require the country to be able to implement a lot of austerity measures, which will include lifting of any subsidies. It will require having to privatize SOEs that are non-performing. It will require having to have wage freeze. It will require us having to be able to go back to a cash budget to be able to reduce the budget deficit. So irrespective of who wins, these measures will require to be implemented. It's just a question of what policies they'll be implementing to support the austerity measures.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. We have one more question about the politics or about the elections. What, in your view, are the most important reforms that the government needs to implement post-election? Rose, maybe you could just give us a short answer, please.
I think what needs to be done, I'll still comment on the economy. I'm not an economist, but it makes a difference who wins the elections. The donor confidence, the investors' confidence carries weight. So really, when you look at the way the government has performed, I think if the ruling party, the current party wins, we are in for trouble. They will not even be able to sit down and say, look, let us negotiate with our donors or with the investors, because there's no confidence. So if Hakainde won, probably there will be that opportunity. So I think that's what I would say on that, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, then Ninya Taproga, I hope I pronounce it right, wants to know, writes, Rose just spoke about violence and hunger. In these situations, women and girls are often the ones who struggle most. I would be interested in how particularly women and girls are affected by the current humanitarian crisis in the country, and what do organizations like CARE do to specifically support that group? Henry, maybe you could say something.
Yeah, thank you very much. In responding to both the COVID crisis as well as the climate change crisis, the drought that we've had in the last few years, CARE did some gender analysis in about 6 rural districts of Zambia to determine how the different genders were being affected: the men, the women, the girls, and the boys. And we found that in terms of the drought, or generally in terms of livelihoods, women tended to take a bigger burden to look after the family when there is a crisis. They are the ones that walk long distances to fetch water. They go long distances to get firewood. And they are the ones that see the children when they are hungry and crying for food. And so we try as much as possible in designing our responses to make sure that the voices of the women are upfront as we plan in the interventions that we do. In fact, talking about what needs to change even post-elections, I know we talk strongly about issues of gender down here. But I think the type of crisis that we have is one that doesn't attract it's not attractive. It doesn't catch attention because it's slow onset. We have seen the floods and the rock falls in India, I think, are all over today's news because you can get figures of what has happened, what damage, and what needs to be done to correct the situation. The climate crisis we have here is slow onset. It doesn't give you figures, immediately. And therefore, even the interventions, even as we look at strategizing on how we handle this as a nation, because this is not going away anytime soon, would be one of getting community-based adaptation. And this would need to include women's voice. In both the COVID and the climate, the climate change, humanitarian crisis that we have, issues are around in people doing things for themselves. We are trying to build resilience in people so that they can respond on their own. But while we are doing that, I think all said, and despite all efforts to look at policies and instruments that Zambia is party to, I think we still need more effective agriculture and climate change resilience policies that would address specific vulnerabilities in the agriculture sector. Trevor talked about market systems and policies, and we have a monoculture here where everybody talks about growing maize. And maize is very sensitive to climate variation. We need to diversify, grow other crops that are of high value, create value chains for this. And then that gives us alternatives for people to sustain themselves when we have these climate variabilities. So, yeah, women play a big role because if you look at the farm labor force, women do a lot on the farm. They're the producers.
Thank you, Henry. Trevor, talking a bit more about the economic situation, maybe you could include the gender aspect. I mean, one can imagine if there would be access to internet, computers, etc., teaching the women how to code, for example, would be one thing that could work from at home, for example. I mean, maybe it sounds crazy to you, but is that an idea? I mean, you have experience with startups. Is that something that could work out, or what vision do you have for a better economical situation in the future?
So the one positive that has actually happened, especially around the African continent, is that we have started to recognize the importance of women in entrepreneurship in business. What you do see is statistically, the empirical evidence is actually saying that women entrepreneurs actually generate greater revenue. And when they do generate the revenue is actually going directly to support the well-being of the families in terms of their nutritional status, their access to sanitation, their access to education. So it is key aspect that we are able to support the women entrepreneurs because they are directly speaking to poverty reduction on the African continent. The key aspects that come with this is that there are also cultural issues that we need to be able to change, because historically women were not allowed to own, say, a title to land. And this was always an issue, but also access to finance. That a woman who was trying to raise access to finance prior to this, they probably needed the approval of the husband to be able to do this, or somebody to countersign for them to be able to access this funding. So I think these are the issues that we need to be able to address to improve the capacity of women to contribute to the economic development of the country. And what you do find is that if we are able to do this, it will generally be easier for us to achieve economic sustainability. And statistically, I think if you actually look at demographics in the country, you find that there's 51% women in the country and 49% are men. So the number is actually higher, and they're responsible to the grassroots in terms of supporting the basically the children as well as the community in providing nutritional status.
Thank you, Trevor. There's one more question that goes directly to you from Teresa Kolberg. When discussing agriculture and climate change that Henry just mentioned, how can the economy grow from agriculture? How do you integrate an agriculture country to the global economy?
So this is to me. Okay.
Trevor?
Sorry, that's my question, right?
That's your question. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you for that question. It's a very interesting question, but you also must appreciate where the African continent is. Zambia is historically been a one commodity country in terms of the exports that has been dependent on copper, and 70% of its export revenue is generated from copper. But we've got massive arable land as well as water bodies to be able to support agriculture. What we seem not to have fallen short in terms of having to achieve is agricultural value chain development, because through the value chain is the only way we can actually access the markets. Otherwise, we've got a challenge in terms of being able to build the kind of quantities of agriculture products to be able to go onto the international market. Because the majority of the producers in Zambia are small-scale producers, and their quantities are insufficient for them to go on the open market. So for us to be able to achieve the quantums that are required for us to be able to go on the commercial market, we need to be able to consolidate through agricultural value chains. And this has been one of the key aspects that has been lacking, that we need to be able to create this. And this is what is going to be able to put Zambia on a platform where we can actually be competitive in saying that we have diversified our economy from the mineral exports of copper to agriculture production. Right now, we've got agriculture production, but it is not agriculture production that we can put on the commercial market in terms of going into the global space.
Okay, that's another question for you, Trevor. Could you say which industries are most promising? We mentioned maize and copper, but maybe additional ones, or what do you have in mind?
So the basic one that we need to start from, obviously, in terms of most promising right now is the copper industry. What you have seen is that on the global space, we are all the universal space is going towards having to design electric cars for zero emission by 2030. And this zero emission will require copper to go into there. So at the moment, the copper price is around $10,000 metric ton. It's the best it has been in 10 years. And that is a very key industry that the country can capitalize on, because it will continue to grow for the next foreseeable decade. The second one is obviously agriculture, because of where we are positioned. We have got 8 neighboring countries, and we have got both arable land as well as water bodies to be able to produce primary agricultural goods to export into countries around the region. Outside that, we have got the areas that are speaking to tourism. Obviously, now tourism has been affected by issues of COVID, but we've also got the capacity to be able to do power generation in energy, which is can either be solar or hydro. And I think that is a very big potential. We could also do wind-generated energy as well. And that is a very key major area that we can capitalize on. But also in terms of manufacturing is that the country has got all the raw materials to be able to go into manufacturing. And this is something that we need to be able to exploit. But our policies need to be driven towards having to support local development in the country. Outside this, obviously, is an issue where we need to build capacity for the private sector to drive the economic development in the country.
Thank you, Trevor. We are coming to the end of our discussion. And finally, I would like to know from you, from the three of you, what kind of headline would you like to read in the international news? Maybe BBC Online, DW, or I don't know, CNN. What kind of headline would you like to read? Trevor, you are thinking of it, Henry or Rose?
I'm thinking of it, but if I was looking for a headline for Zambia, I would be saying Zambia's GDP has hit a 10% GDP growth. I think that is the best one that I would have, because this one is the one that speaks to sustainable growth for everybody. When there's a GDP, find that the per capita income of everybody grows and the household income is more secure.
Okay, so one more question, Trevor. Do you think that if there would be more reports about Zambia, do you think that the people would suffer less?
Yes, I think so. If the problem is highlighted, you find that there are more concerted effort in terms of having to resolve the issue, but also the parties that are involved in there are more cautious about what they will do or not do in having to deal with the problem.
Thank you. Henry, what is the headline that you would like to read? Maybe in 5 years, maybe in next years, maybe after the elections. It's up to you.
Well, in the long term, I would like to read about what the power holders in the Global South are achieving in responding to what the power holders in the North are doing. In the North, they are talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I would like us to look at the other end. You know, look at issues around how we manage carbon, you know, reforestation, agroforestation, so that we have a more, you know, more trees to deal with the greenhouse gases, because it's unquestioned we have to have a balance. On one side, we reduce the emissions. On the other side, we also, you know, have the trees use the emissions, whether it's for photosynthesis or whatever, but then get the emissions out of the air. Because that's one side we are not talking much about. We are talking about, you know, reduction of emissions, but we should also be talking about rejuvenating the forests, getting the trees to grow again, you know, working around the watershed areas, so that when we reduce the emissions, we come to a balance, you know, in nature where we can start bringing down the temperature or start halting the effects of the greenhouses and start moving backwards to see if we can get back to normal.
Thank you, Henry. Yeah, completely different aspect. And yeah. Rose, if you could give me just the headline of the article.
The headline I would love to see is a headline which says Zambia's democratic credentials have improved. The rule of law, zero corruption, human rights, because no matter what good intentions we have, what good ideas we have, if the environment is not enabling, all these are good ideas where we want investment, where we want to improve the livelihoods, no investors will come in if the ground is not conducive. If there's corruption, they know that whatever investment they're going to put in it will go to waste. If the rule of law continues to be weak, they know that the culprits will continue to be corrupt and nothing will happen to them. So for me, I would like to see our credentials change for the better. And I'm looking forward to the elections on 12 August, and I hope that happens.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the three of you. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Take care. All the best for you.
Yeah, thank you.
And now I would like to hand over to Dr. René Klaff, the head of the International Department of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. Welcome, Dr. Klaff.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. for Freedom at the end, not only of this session today on Zambia, but at the end of the session of this whole series, which we were having over the last so many weeks. Together with CARE International, we really appreciate that this cooperation could be realized. Not only because CARE International, CARE Germany and CARE International is a very renowned institution in itself, but also because of the historical relationship that especially we Europeans and especially we Germans and Austrians also have with CARE. Just to remind you that CARE was established in 1945 in the background of the deep humanitarian crisis that had happened here was visible here in Europe after the Second World War. And if it hadn't been with the help of CARE, the situation for millions of people would have been much more difficult. So I start with this to tell you that you never know who's on the receiving end of humanitarian crisis. Things can change. So we appreciate this cooperation, which was focused 10 different sessions on countries that are not so much in the limelight of international media reports in these days. Some countries you may call also forgotten countries, not all of them, of course. Especially in the situation which we are having since 1.5 years in the Corona pandemic, 2020 and 2021, which had enormous backlashes and difficulties on a global scale, not just in those 10 countries that we were dealing with, but everywhere. This has also one consequence, I would say, many consequences, but one on the political and discourse level. Countries tend to look inward more than they did before under the focus of the Corona pandemic. Headlines here in Germany are focusing on Germany first and foremost, and what's happening to my city and to the neighboring city and to my holiday country somewhere in Europe, and not so much on the international level. I'm not saying that this is astonishing. I'm also not saying that this is morally bad or anything of that kind. It's just a fact. It's a fact that has political consequences today and tomorrow, and in long term. So this series on these 10 countries is also an attempt to react from our part, not to neglect what is going on in other countries of this world. And of course, we here in Germany have been affected by Corona, but in many other countries around the globe, the situation was much more difficult than here. Healthcare systems are less sophisticated, death tolls are much higher than here, and vaccinations for the entire society are not in sight. And yet, the Corona pandemic is not the only crisis under humanitarian and social conditions. There are many other crises which have not diminished just because there's this new one. So this is the whole background of this 10 sessions series that we were having over the last 3 months. Among the countries that we focused on were some in which the Naumann Foundation for Freedom, which is a political institution working for civic education in different fields. Some of these countries we are having long-term project histories. In Pakistan and Ukraine, we even have fully fledged offices for decades. Some other countries are project countries where we are engaged not with our own offices in the countries, but which play a role in regional projects such as Mali and Guatemala. And other countries we don't reach at all, or only reach from time to time, as for instance is the case with Zambia. So for us, this discussion series was also a good opportunity to learn about the problems and challenges of these countries, and a good opportunity to be able to share our own expertise and political outlook with the participants of these online events. I'm told that so far, not counting today, we have reached more than 660 live viewers. With 30 experts, we were able to share knowledge and expertise about countries in Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, Asia, and Oceania. Again, this is in itself a valuable experience for us in our work for democratic development, human rights, and political engagement. There are many things that we will draw from this series. I may just add that the Naaman Foundation is right now on the verge of establishing a global partnership hub in Nairobi, Kenya, where we try to focus on answers and solutions from a liberal perspective to the challenging problems that we face in many countries of the global south, following our aim and orientation of human freedom and individual responsibility. I think the whole development scenery and strategies, which we also touched in the discussion earlier on today, needs a restart in many respects, focusing on what kind of expertise in the countries that we are talking about can be used and should be used. Thank you for joining for one or more events in this series. Thank you to the audience and our moderators and of course our experts today. We hope you learned as much as we did, and we will continue the conversations about underreported regions in the years to come. And with that, I would like to hand over back to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. René Klaff. Thank you very much. And I would like to only tell you that if you missed one of the web talks, you have the opportunity to check out the website of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom and watch the other ones. And for the end, I want to thank all the viewers for your attention and your good questions. Thanks to all the experts for sharing your knowledge. Take care and goodbye.